Today I'd like us to think about the Good Samaritan that we forget. The Good Samaritan might be the best known of all the Gospel parables. It is known far beyond Christianity. People of any faith, people of no faith, are familiar with this story. The term Good Samaritan is part of our daily vocabulary. Anyone who helps in time of need is now called a Good Samaritan. Perhaps we are too familiar with this parable. We have heard it so often that we do not listen carefully and we miss important details. Consider just 3 details of this parable which are often neglected. The title is incongruous, the message is insulting, and the lawyer's question is inverted. The title, The Good Samaritan, is a term of respect for us. But the audience of Christ would have been horrified at such a title. Samaritans were considered anything but good. The Jews and Samaritans were bitter enemies, socially, religiously, and politically. It was unthinkable to a Jew that a Samaritan could be a good person, as we today would find a term like a good terrorist to be offensive. The audience of Christ found the idea of a Good Samaritan repugnant. And that incongruity is precisely the point of this parable. The one commonly judged as evil was the one who was, in fact, good. The parable was intended to shock. The parable speaks again today to our prejudices. We are often blind to the goodness in others. When we assume that another can do no good, we miss their virtue. A cranky neighbor, a difficult child, a feisty in-law. This is related to the second neglected point, the insult. This parable insulted the audience of Christ. Not only did the Samaritan, presumed to be evil, do the good deed, but the priest and the Levite, presumed to be virtuous, did not help. Christ often stirs the conscience of his audience with sarcasm. He shames them, in a good sense. Failure to recognize goodness in others not only denies their virtue, but also deflects the challenge to their virtue. Too often, we intentionally ignore the goodness of others. A neighbor, a friend, a spouse, because it exposes our own lack of virtue. If, for example, I concede that my neighbor is generous, I must face my own selfishness. If I admit that my friend is patient, then I must consider my own impatience. If I acknowledge that my spouse is forgiving, I'm challenged to forgive. The most neglected point of this parable is the inversion of the question. Christ did not answer the question he had been asked. The lawyer had asked, "Who is my neighbor?" Christ did not answer that question. He responded with a parable and then asked the scholar this question: which of these was neighbor to the victim? The lawyer had asked, "Who is my neighbor?" Christ switched the question around and asked not, "Who is my neighbor?" but, "To whom should I be a neighbor?" Not who is my friend, but to whom ought I to be a friend? The parable does not ask, who deserves goodness, but rather, to whom should I be good? Christian virtue does not consist in returning favors, but in offering goodness without hope of recompense. Christianity is not a mutual benefit society. The basis of Christian charity is not, are others deserving, but simply, are they in need? Christian charity, as God's grace, is a gift, not a gift exchange. It is a pure gift, given without expectation of recompense. The title of the parable is incongruous. A Samaritan, presumed to be bad, was in fact a good Samaritan. The parable is insulting. Those deemed virtuous were less virtuous than those whom they judged inferior. And the question was inverted. Not who is my neighbor, but to whom should I be a neighbor? The despised Samaritan was actually a good person who helped a stranger in need without expecting repayment. Go and do likewise.